He was a man who had buried a dream. He'd dug a hole for it deep in the frozen dirt of his own heart, shoveled snow and silence over it, and walked away. The dream was simple. It was the dream of being a father, and a doctor in a dusty town 2 winters back had told him it was a dream that would never come true. The words felt like stones in his gut. Scar tissue. Never take. Barren. So Heath Camden lived with the cold. He let it seep into his bones, into the quiet corners of his cabin high in the mountains. He was a trapper, a ghost, a man as weathered and hard as the granite peaks that surrounded him. He'd come down to the town of Grafton once a season, trade his furs for salt and flour, and disappear before the sun had a chance to properly warm the muddy streets. He never lingered. He never spoke more than he had to. But this time was different. This time, he stood by the hitching post, long after the freight wagon had rumbled away. In his pocket was a letter, creased and worn from 100 readings. It was the doctor's letter, the one that served as the headstone for his buried dream. He'd come to town to get drunk, to forget, to do anything other than sit in that silent cabin with its 3 extra chairs he'd built for a family that never was. He didn't know he was walking toward his destiny. He just knew he was walking. He followed the noise, the low murmur of a crowd gathered near the old church. A poster was nailed to a tree, the words stark and ugly. Auction today. Not horses, not land, children. His stomach twisted into a knot of ice and fire. He saw them then, on the church steps, huddled together like frightened deer. A woman with a face like a sour plum stood over them, her voice sharp and brittle. 3 of them, all siblings, she barked to the silent crowd. Ages 6, 4, and just shy of 2. No known ailments, no kin to speak of. Healthy enough to work when they're older. The crowd shuffled their feet. Men looked away. Women whispered behind their hands. These weren't just orphans. They were outcasts, the remnants of a family that had vanished into sickness and poverty. No one wanted them. The eldest, a boy with a clenched jaw and old man's eyes, stood in front of his sisters like a tiny, defiant soldier. The girl next to him, all tangled hair and fierce loyalty, gripped the smallest child's hand so tight their knuckles were bone white. The baby, a bundle of rags, just stared out with huge, vacant eyes. $2 for the set, the woman shouted, her frustration growing. They have to go somewhere. Anyone. Silence, a cold, heavy silence that condemned 3 little lives to an unknown, terrible fate. Heath didn't think, he didn't plan, he moved, 1 step, then another. The crowd parted for him like the sea, whispering as the big mountain man strode forward. He reached into his coat, his hand closing around the few coins he had. 3, he said. The word was rough, like gravel scraped from his soul. A collective gasp went through the crowd, not at the price, but at the man who'd said it. The woman on the steps blinked, her sour face slack with shock. Sir, do you understand what you're doing? Heath didn't answer her. He just walked up the steps, his worn boots heavy on the wood. He dropped 3 silver dollars into her gloved hand. The coins clinked, a sound that felt as loud as a gunshot. It was the sound of a life changing forever. He knelt. He was a giant of a man, and kneeling brought him eye to eye with the oldest boy. The boy squared his shoulders. We don't bite, he said, his voice a tiny challenge. A ghost of a smile touched Heath's lips. Didn't figure you did. The little girl beside him, the one with the fierce grip, whispered, her voice barely a breath. You got a house? Heath nodded. Got food? He nodded again, slower this time. The weight of it was settling on him. A house, food, what else did they need? He had no idea. He looked at the smallest one, the baby. She hadn't made a sound. She just stared at him, her gaze so steady it was unnerving. She blinked once, twice, and then she whispered a single word, a word so soft he almost missed it, a word that struck him like a bolt of lightning from a clear blue sky. Pa! The world stopped, the murmuring crowd, the sour-faced woman, the cold spring wind, it all vanished. The only thing that existed was that one impossible word. He hadn't heard it in years, not aimed at him, not even in his wildest, most painful dreams. He looked up at the woman. Her face had gone pale. She's barely spoken in weeks, she stammered, wringing her hands. No one told her to say that, I swear it. Heath didn't hear her. He couldn't speak. He simply reached out his large, calloused hands and lifted the smallest child into his arms. She didn't fight. She didn't cry. She just settled against his chest, her tiny head finding the crook of his neck as if it were made for her. She sighed, a sound of pure, unearned trust. The crowd erupted in whispers. Crazy mountain man. What's he going to do with them? He's got no wife, no sense. But Heath was already deaf to them. He only felt the warmth of a little girl's breath against his collarbone. He only saw two other small children stepping closer, their fear slowly being replaced by a fragile, desperate hope. He had come down the mountain to bury what was left of his heart. Instead, he was walking back up, with 3 reasons to let it beat again. The journey back to his cabin was a silent one. The borrowed wagon groaned under the weight of their few belongings and the heavy, unspoken questions that filled the air. He'd bought supplies, more oats, more flour, a small jug of milk he had no idea what to do with. It felt strange. For years, he'd only had to feed himself. Now he was responsible for 3 other heartbeats. He learned their names on the trail. The boy, the little soldier, was Isaac. He spoke in short, clipped sentences, as if words were a currency he couldn't afford to waste. The girl was Nora, 4 years old with a stubborn set to her chin that Heath recognized in himself. She spent most of the ride with her arms crossed, a tiny fortress of distrust. And the baby, the one who had called him Pa. Nora called her Lahi. She never said the word again, not once. But she never stopped looking at him, her wide, dark eyes following his every move, as if she was waiting for him to prove he was worthy of the name. They reached the cabin as dusk painted the sky in shades of bruised purple and faded orange. It was a simple place, built by his own 2 hands, nestled in a clearing of pine and aspen. To him, it had always been a fortress of solitude, a place of sharp edges and cold silence, but seen through their eyes, it looked different. It looked small. It looked lonely. It had never been built to hold the sound of laughter. It had never been meant to hear the patter of small feet on the pinewood floors. Still, they went inside. Heath made porridge with dried berries, the same meal he ate most nights. They ate in near silence. Isaac stared into the flames of the hearth as if he were trying to read the future. Nora poked at her food with a twig, her expression a mixture of suspicion and hunger. And Lahi, she sat beside Heath, leaning against his leg, her sticky fingers clinging to his trousers. Eventually, her head drooped, and she fell asleep, a tiny weight of impossible trust. That night, Heath didn't sleep. He sat in his chair by the dying fire, the rifle across his lap, though he wasn't sure what he was guarding against. The cabin felt alien. Every creak of the logs, every sigh of the wind felt like a question he couldn't answer. What have you done? He had no wife. He had no plan. He had no idea how to braid hair or soothe a nightmare or answer the 1,000 questions a child might ask. All he had were 3 fewer silver dollars and 3 small, fragile lives sleeping under his roof. He stared into the glowing embers, the name echoing in his mind. Pa, he hadn't earned it, but he was damned if he was going to walk away from it. The sun crept over the ridge, its light filtering through the dusty cabin window like a hesitant guest. Heath stirred from his chair, his neck stiff, a coarse wool blanket draped over him. He didn't remember pulling it up. He blinked, his eyes finding the small forms curled together on a makeshift bed of furs near the hearth. They were still there. It hadn't been a fever dream born of loneliness and cheap whiskey. 3 children were in his home. His children. The thought was so foreign, so terrifyingly immense, that he had to brace himself against the wall. They hadn't cried in the night. They hadn't tried to run. They had simply stayed, as if they belonged here more than he did. He pushed himself to his feet, his joints protesting, and stepped outside into the crisp morning air. The scent of pine was sharp and clean. A bird called from a high branch. He had built this place for a life he never got to live. Now, that life had arrived, uninvited and utterly dependent on him. Could he do this? Could a man as broken as him possibly fix anyone else? When he came back inside, Isaac was awake. The boy stood ramrod straight, his small fists clenched, his eyes full of a defiant challenge. He looked like he was expecting a fight. "You're not taking us back," Isaac stated. It wasn't a question. It was a dare. Heath met his gaze. The boy had seen too many people change their minds. Too many backs turned on him. "No," Heath said, his voice rough with sleep. He moved to the stove and began to ladle oats into 3 bowls. It was more oats than he'd normally use in 3 days. "You eat." Isaac watched him, his suspicions slowly melting away, replaced by a flicker of something else. He gave a single sharp nod. "Good, I'll help with the chores after." Nora sat up next, rubbing her eyes, her hair a wild tangle of brown knots. "Porridge again?" she grumbled, her voice filled with the dramatic flair only a 4-year-old can muster. "Does everything in the mountains taste like old socks?" For the first time in what felt like a decade, Heath almost laughed. The sound died in his throat, but the feeling remained, a strange warmth in his chest. He slid a bowl toward her without a word. Lahi, the little one, crawled from the pile of furs and made a beeline for him, wrapping her arms around his leg. She still hadn't spoken another word to him, but her actions were louder than any vocabulary. She clung to him like he was the only solid thing in a world that had always been shaky ground. He didn't understand it, this instant bond she seemed to feel. He only knew that her tiny arms felt like an anchor, and for a man who'd been adrift for so long, being held down was a strangely welcome sensation. After their silent breakfast, the work began. He took Isaac outside to the goat pen, where a winter storm had splintered a fence post. He handed the boy a mallet and a handful of nails, expecting to have to show him what to do. But Isaac didn't wait for instructions. He studied the broken plank, his brow furrowed in concentration. Then, with a focus that was startling in one so young, he set to work, his small hammer strikes surprisingly precise. The boy wasn't soft, he wasn't lazy. Someone, somewhere, had taught him how to work, probably their father. The thought sent a pang through Heath. There was a past here, a wound still tender and raw. One wrong move and he could make it worse. He said nothing, just worked beside the boy, letting the rhythmic tap-tap-tap of their hammers fill the silence. Nora, apparently deciding that indoor chores were beneath her, emerged onto the porch, dragging a broom twice her size. She attacked the porch with a vengeance, muttering to herself about dust and useless boys and the general unfairness of the world. Heath let her be. He recognized a kindred spirit in her stubborn fury. But when she tripped over a loose board and went down hard, scraping her elbow, he was there before the first tear could fall. She flinched, ready to bite back any offer of pity, but Heath simply knelt, his large hand gently taking her arm to inspect the raw scrape. She stared at him, her tough exterior cracking just a little. "My papa used to carry peppermints in his pocket," she said suddenly, her voice small. Heath blinked, taken aback. I don't have any of those." She shrugged, a gesture that was far too adult for her small frame. "You got oatmeal," she declared, as if this were a perfectly logical comparison. "It's not the same, but it counts." That evening, as the shadows grew long and the air turned cold, Heath found Isaac sitting on a stump at the edge of the clearing, staring out at the vast, dark forest. "You got questions," Heath said, not asking. It was a fact. Isaac didn't look at him. He just stared into the trees. "Where's your wife?" The question was blunt, but Heath wasn't offended. He deserved it. He'd brought them into his life without a single explanation. The wind sighed through the pines, a lonely sound. "She's gone," he said at last, the words feeling like rust in his mouth. "Years now." Isaac nodded, a slow, solemn gesture of understanding. "You don't got any other kids?" "No." The silence stretched between them, thick and heavy. Heath could feel the real question hanging in the air, the one that truly mattered. He waited for it. "Then why'd you buy us?" Heath looked at the boy, at his thin shoulders and the fierce pride in his eyes. He could have given 1,000 answers. He could have lied. He could have said it was pity or charity. But he owed this boy the truth, or at least a piece of it. "Felt like I had more room than most," Heath said quietly. "Figured that was enough." Isaac held his gaze for a long moment, searching his face for lies, for traps. He seemed to find none. He gave another one of his solemn, single nods, then stood up and walked back to the cabin without another word. Later that night, with the children sleeping soundly and the fire crackling a warm, gentle rhythm, Heath did something he hadn't done in months. He pulled out the doctor's letter, the one that had been his certificate of failure, the one that declared him barren, a dead end, a man whose line would end with him. He read the familiar, cruel words one last time. But tonight, they didn't sting as much. Tonight, they felt like they were about to someone else, a ghost from a different life. Upstairs, 3 hearts were beating under his roof. In the morning, there would be chores to do and mouths to feed. He folded the letter, leaned forward, and dropped it into the heart of the fire. He watched the paper curl, blacken, and turn to weightless ash. He was still broken. He was still a man with a past full of ghosts. But he was no longer alone, and that, he was starting to realize, changed everything. The cabin began to change. It wasn't about noise. Heath was a man who valued quiet. But the silence itself was different now. It was a comfortable silence, filled with the soft sounds of life. The scratch of Isaac's charcoal on a piece of wood. The whisper of Nora telling a story to her dolls made of twigs and cloth. The soft, rhythmic breathing of Lahi sleeping in a box near the hearth. They were settling in. They were building a life in the cracks of the one Heath had left for dead. Then the storm hit. It came without warning, a late spring blizzard that roared down from the peaks with the fury of a starving wolf. Wind and sleet hammered the small cabin. The roof groaned under the weight of the snow. The fire sputtered, fighting against the drafts that snaked through the walls. In the dead of night, a scream ripped through the howl of the wind. Heath was out of his chair in an instant, his heart pounding in his chest. Lahi was standing by the hearth, her small body trembling, her eyes wide with terror. She was pointing a shaky finger at the door. "Man," she whispered, the word choked with fear. "Man outside." Heath froze. He hadn't heard anything over the storm. But the child was terrified. Isaac was already at the window, peering out into the swirling white chaos. Nora sat bolt upright, clutching one of her twig dolls like a shield. "I don't see anything, Pa," Isaac said, the name slipping out naturally for the first time. But Heath wasn't taking any chances. He'd lived in these mountains long enough to trust fear. He grabbed the heavy rifle from its pegs above the door and cracked it open. The wind slammed into him like a physical blow, driving snow and ice into his face. He stepped out onto the porch, his eyes scanning the impenetrable wall of white. Nothing. No tracks that weren't already being erased by the second. No sound but the screaming wind. It had to be a nightmare. A child's bad dream, amplified by the storm. He turned to go back inside, his shoulders slumping with relief. And that's when he saw it. Nailed to his door, right at eye level, was a piece of folded paper. It was new. It hadn't been there when he'd come in for the night. His blood ran cold. With trembling fingers, he ripped it from the wood. The nail was still shiny. He stumbled back inside, kicking the door shut against the storm. The children were watching him, their faces pale in the flickering firelight. "What is it?" Isaac asked, his voice low. Heath unfolded the paper. The handwriting was jagged, crude, scratched into the paper with what looked like a piece of charcoal. The message was short, but it hit him like a punch to the gut. "They ain't yours. Don't forget it." He stared at the words, his knuckles white as he crumpled the paper in his fist. Someone had been out there. In the middle of a blizzard, someone had crept up to his home, close enough to nail a message to his door, and vanished without a trace. He looked at the 3 terrified faces staring up at him. They were looking to him for safety, for answers, and for the first time, he felt a fear that had nothing to do with his own loneliness. It was the ice-cold terror of a father who realizes his children are in danger. "What did it say, Pa?" Nora whispered. Heath forced his face into a mask of calm. He looked at each of them, forcing a strength he didn't feel into his voice. "It's nothing," he lied, tossing the crumpled paper into the fire. "Just the wind playing tricks." He didn't sleep that night, or the next. He sat in his chair by the fire, the rifle never leaving his lap, his eyes fixed on the door. The storm outside was nothing compared to the one that was now raging inside him. He had thought the world had forgotten about him. He had thought he could hide up here with his broken heart and his newfound family. He was wrong. Someone was watching them, and they were coming to reclaim what Heath had just started to believe was his. For 3 days, the world was a white tomb. The snow fell relentlessly, burying the trails, swallowing the fences, and isolating the cabin in a silent, suffocating blanket. The fear from that night settled in with them, a 4th, unwelcome resident. It lived in Isaac's hand, which now rested on a small hatchet by his cot. It lived in Nora's sudden silences. It lived in the way Lahi would startle at the slightest noise. Heath didn't speak of the note again, but its presence was a poison in the air. He kept the fire roaring and his rifle clean, and his gaze was constantly fixed on the tree line. He had invited life into his home, and in doing so, he had invited danger. On the 4th morning, the storm broke. The world outside was blindingly bright and eerily silent. It was the kind of quiet that meant something was wrong. Nature is never that still unless something unnatural has disturbed it. He saddled his mare, the only one he'd kept. "Isaac," he said, his voice grim, "keep the door barred. Don't let the girls out. Not for anything." Isaac just nodded, his face serious. He was no longer just a boy. He was the man of the house. Heath rode down the mountain, his eyes scanning for any sign, any track that didn't belong. The path he'd taken with the children just a week ago was buried under feet of fresh snow. It should have been pristine. It wasn't. Halfway down the ridge, he found them. Faint but undeniable. Wagon tracks, hoof prints, and the deep impressions of a man's heavy boots. Someone had come up the mountain during the blizzard. They hadn't come all the way to the cabin, but they had come close. Frighteningly close. He followed the tracks until they veered west, heading deeper into the unforgiving wilderness, towards a place the locals called Dead Man's Hollow. It was a place of dark legends, of lost miners and strange, whispering caves. No one went there willingly. Whoever was watching them was not just some drifter. They knew the mountains, and they weren't afraid of its darkest corners. He turned back, a cold dread coiling in his stomach. That night, Isaac found him staring into the fire. "You think it's their kin?" the boy asked, his voice low. Heath knew who he meant, the family that had abandoned them. "Maybe," he grunted, "but kin that leaves you to be sold like cattle ought to stay buried?" Isaac was silent for a long moment. He didn't argue, and that silence told Heath everything he needed to know. The boy remembered. The days that followed were a strange mix of domestic peace and simmering tension. Heath taught Isaac how to set snares for rabbits, and the boy proved to be a quick, clever study. Nora took over the small, struggling garden with a fierce determination, scolding the cabbage shoots as if they were naughty children. And Lahi was his shadow. Her little hand was always seeking his, her presence a constant warm weight by his side. She was the heart of this strange little family, the one who had named him, the one who had claimed him. One morning, as he was mending a harness, she toddled over, half asleep, and leaned against his knee. She mumbled something in her sleep, a soft, blurry sound. Heath leaned closer. "Papa, wait." The word hit him like a physical blow. Papa, not the formal, tentative pa that Isaac had started to use. This was different. It was a name, a title, a belonging. He froze, not daring to breathe, not daring to move. Lahi, oblivious, just snuggled closer and drifted back to sleep. He couldn't move. He, Heath Camden, the barren man, the lonely ghost of the mountain, was Papa. He had buried that name, that hope, with the ashes of the doctor's letter. But here it was, resurrected by a child who had no idea the power she held. He was outside later, splitting firewood with a ferocity born of confusion and a terrifying, burgeoning love. The axe rose and fell, each strike a blow against the man he used to be. He was so lost in the rhythm, so lost in his thoughts, that he didn't hear the stranger approach. He only saw the second shadow fall across the snow. Heath spun around, the axe held ready. A man stood at the edge of the clearing. He was broad-shouldered, wrapped in a thick, greasy coat, his face hidden by the shadow of a low-brimmed hat. He didn't look armed, but Heath had lived long enough to know that the most dangerous things are the ones you can't see. "You're the one," the stranger said, his voice as rough as scraped stone. "The one who bought 'em." Heath's grip tightened on the axe handle. "Who's asking?" "Heard talk in town," the man went on, taking a slow step forward. "Talk that a crazy mountain hermit took in 3 strays. That true?" "Why do you care?" Heath growled. The man shrugged, a slow, deliberate movement. "Because one of 'em's mine." The words were a lie. They had to be. "They were sold," Heath said, his voice flat and cold, fair and square. "There was nothing fair about it," the stranger rasped. He took another step. Heath could see his eyes now, small and dark like a boar's. "But I didn't come to take 'em back." That chilled Heath more than any threat. "Then why did you come?" The stranger's mouth twisted into something that might have been a smile, but it was full of rot. "I come to warn you. You think you did a good thing? You think $3 silver buys you peace? You fool. Those children weren't abandoned. They were hidden. Hidden from a man who wants them back something fierce. A man by the name of Barlow." "And now," the stranger said, his voice dropping to a low, menacing whisper, "thanks to you parading them through town, he knows exactly where to find them." The man turned and melted back into the trees, leaving Heath standing in the sudden, deafening silence. That night, there was no pretense of calm. Heath gathered the children. "We're moving," he said, his voice leaving no room for argument. "To the old trapping cabin, 2 ridges over. It's smaller, easier to defend." They didn't ask why. They saw it in his face. Nora packed her twig dolls. Isaac grabbed his hatchet. Lahi just held Heath's hand, her tiny fingers a lifeline in a world that was suddenly threatening to pull him under. The new cabin was a hovel, barely more than 4 walls and a roof. But it was defensible. Heath boarded up the one small window, rigged the door with a tripwire attached to a tin can full of pebbles. He spent 2 days setting snares and deadfalls on every path leading to the clearing. They were no longer a family. They were a garrison under siege. One night, Nora came running in from the outhouse, her face as white as the moon. "There's a man," she gasped, her voice trembling. "In the woods. He's watching us." Heath grabbed the rifle and a lantern and plunged into the darkness. He found the tracks easily, heavy boot prints, pacing back and forth in a tight, agitated line just beyond the light of the cabin. The man hadn't tried to get closer. He was just watching, waiting. Heath sat up all night, the rifle across his lap, his back to the fire, his eyes on the black square of the boarded-up window. The children slept fitfully in the loft above him, and a terrible thought began to take root in his mind. What if this wasn't about the children? What if Barlow, whoever he was, wasn't the real threat? What if the stranger's warning was a lie, a misdirection? What if this was about him? A man like him, a broken, lonely man, wasn't supposed to find happiness. He wasn't supposed to have a second chance. He wasn't supposed to have 3 small voices calling him Papa. Maybe the world didn't like it when a man tried to put himself back together. Maybe the world sent its own monsters to tear him down again. But he wasn't going to let them. He had burned the letter. He had buried the old Heath Camden. He was a father now, and he would burn the whole world down to keep his children safe. The silence in the new cabin was different. It wasn't the quiet of peace, but the tense, listening silence of prey. Every snap of a twig, every hoot of an owl sent a jolt through their little fortress. Heath barely slept, catnapping in his chair by the door, the rifle always within reach. The children moved like shadows, speaking in whispers, their games forgotten. The watcher in the woods was a constant, unseen presence. Heath found his tracks every morning, a circular path worn into the dirt around their clearing. A silent, patient siege. Who was he? Was he this Barlow the stranger had spoken of? Or someone else entirely? The not knowing was a poison. After a week of this torment, Heath knew he couldn't just wait for the attack. He had to force the enemy's hand. He had to know who he was fighting. He took the children to the nearest town, a grimy little settlement called Fern Hollow. He left them in the care of the blacksmith's wife, a stern but kind woman he'd traded with for years, with strict instructions to stay inside. Then, he started listening. In the dust and grime of the town's only saloon, amidst the smell of stale beer and desperation, he found his answers. He didn't ask directly. He just sat in a dark corner, nursing a single whiskey, and let the town's gossip wash over him. The name Barlow came up. Boone Barlow, a man with a reputation as black as a rotten heart. He used to run freight, but was known more for his heavy fists and his cruel temper. The whispers grew darker. They spoke of a woman he'd been with, a cousin of his who had taken in her sister's children after she'd passed. 3 children, a boy and 2 girls. The cousin and her husband had vanished a year ago. People assumed they'd just packed up and left. But Barlow had stayed, drinking, getting meaner. And he'd started asking questions, asking about the kids. Heath's blood ran cold. It was them. Isaac, Nora, and Lahi weren't just orphans. They were survivors. They were runaways. And the monster they had been running from was Barlow, the man who had likely done something terrible to their guardians. And now he knew where they were. He left the saloon, his mind racing. He had to get back. He had to get the children and disappear, go deeper into the mountains where no one could ever find them. He urged his mare into a frantic gallop, the wind whipping at his face, his heart a cold, hard knot of fear in his chest. He knew something was wrong the moment he cleared the last ridge. The cabin was too quiet. The smoke that should have been curling from the chimney was gone. The door, the one he had so carefully barred, was hanging slightly ajar. "No," he whispered, the words stolen by the wind. "No, no, no." He slid from his horse before it had even stopped, his boots hitting the ground with a thud. He burst through the door, the rifle raised. Empty. The cabin was cold and silent. The fire was dead, nothing but gray ash on the hearthstone. Nora's coat was still on its peg. A half-finished carving of a squirrel lay on the floor where Isaac had been working. And near the ladder to the loft, lying in the dust, was Lahi's favorite twig doll, its little cloth dress torn. He searched frantically, his heart hammering against his ribs. The traps he'd set around the cabin were untouched. Not a single one had been triggered. Whoever took them knew the paths. They knew exactly how to get in and out without making a sound. It wasn't a stranger. It was someone who had been watching, waiting, learning. He found the tracks leading away from the back of the cabin. One set of heavy, deliberate boot prints, Barlow's. But there were smaller prints beside them. The children hadn't been carried. They had walked. That meant they weren't fighting. Not yet. That gave him a sliver of hope, a sliver of time. He didn't pack much, just his rifle, his knife, a pocket full of bullets, and a strip of dried jerky. As he was leaving, his hand brushed against something soft in his coat. It was one of Lahi's little hair ribbons he'd found on the floor. He clenched it in his fist and started to run. The trail was a desperate chase against the setting sun. It led him down into Dead Man's Hollow, the gully of dark legends. The air grew colder, smelling of damp earth and decay. The path twisted through jagged rocks and thorny brush that tore at his clothes. Barlow wasn't trying to hide his trail. He was arrogant. He didn't think anyone would dare to follow him here. He was wrong. As dusk settled, painting the hollow in shades of gray and black, Heath saw it. A faint, flickering light, deep within a narrow crevice in the rock face. The mouth of a cave. From inside, he heard a sound that made his blood boil. A child's cry. Faint, but unmistakable. He moved like a phantom, his rage a cold, controlled fire. He slipped into the cave, the darkness swallowing him whole. The tunnel snaked downward, the air thick with the smell of wet stone and fear. He saw a scrap of Nora's dress caught on a rock. He saw a smudge on the wall where a small hand had tried to steady itself. Then the tunnel opened into a small, damp cavern. A pathetic fire guttered in the center, casting dancing, monstrous shadows on the walls. And he saw them. Isaac, Nora, and Lahi were huddled against the far wall, their wrists bound with crude rope. Their faces were streaked with dirt and tears. Standing over them, his back to the entrance, was a large, hulking figure. Barlow. Heath raised the rifle, the stock settling against his shoulder as naturally as breathing. He had a clear shot. He could end this right now. But as his finger tightened on the trigger, Barlow turned, and Heath's world shattered. Barlow wasn't just standing over them. He was holding Lahi. He had her pressed against his chest, one beefy arm wrapped around her tiny body. And in his other hand, he held a knife. The blade was pressed against her throat. "I wouldn't do that if I were you," Barlow said, his voice a low, chillingly calm growl. His eyes, gleaming in the firelight, were full of a mad, possessive triumph. Heath's breath caught in his throat. The rifle felt impossibly heavy. "Let her go, Barlow," Heath said, his voice shaking with a rage so pure it was almost silent. Barlow laughed, a horrible, wet sound. "Let her go? After all the trouble I went to? To find my family? You must be the fool they said you were." "They're not your family," Heath spat. "Aren't they?" Barlow sneered, his grip tightening on Lahi. The little girl let out a small whimper. "This one's got my sister's eyes. The boy, he's the spittin' image of my brother. And the girl, Nora, she's got her mother's fire. Their blood, my blood. What are you to them? A stranger who bought them for the price of a cheap mule." "You left them," Heath growled, taking a single, slow step forward. "You left them to rot." Barlow's face twisted in fury. "I was making a life for us. I came back for them, and I found them with you. Playing house. I bet they even call you Papa." The word was a curse from his lips. "How does that feel, old man? Knowing you're just a placeholder? Knowing they'll never really be yours?" Every word was a nail hammered into Heath's soul, because it was the same dark fear he'd been fighting himself. "Let her go," Heath repeated, his voice dropping to a deadly whisper. "You shoot me, she dies with me," Barlow hissed, the knife pressing just a little deeper. A tiny bead of red appeared on Lahi's pale skin. Heath's vision swam with red, but he couldn't shoot. He couldn't risk it. He lowered the rifle just an inch, the barrel tilting toward the dirt floor. It was a sign of surrender. And in that moment of perceived victory, Barlow made his mistake. His grip on Lahi loosened for a fraction of a second. His crazed grin widened. That was all Heath needed. Lahi, feeling the shift, did what any terrified child would do. She screamed and twisted, her small fists flailing. It was chaos. It was an opening. Heath didn't hesitate. He dropped the rifle and launched himself across the cavern. He was no longer a man. He was an avalanche, an earthquake, a father's rage made flesh. He crashed into Barlow with the force of a battering ram. The two men hit the ground in a tangle of limbs and fury. The knife clattered away into the darkness. It was a brawl then, brutal and primal. A fist caught Heath in the ribs, sending a shock of pain through his body. Barlow was a bear of a man, strong and vicious, but Heath was fighting for more than his own life. He fought for the sound of Nora's humming, for the quiet pride in Isaac's eyes, for the weight of Lahi's head on his shoulder. He got his knee into Barlow's chest, pinning him to the damp earth, and he let his fists fly. He rained down blows, fueled by every sleepless night, every moment of fear, every ounce of love he felt for the children cowering against the wall. He didn't stop until Barlow lay limp and broken beneath him. He staggered to his feet, his chest heaving, his knuckles bloody. The cave was silent, save for his own ragged breathing. Then, a small figure launched itself at him. Lahi wrapped her arms around his legs, burying her face in his trousers, her small body shaking with sobs. Nora and Isaac were right behind her, untying their own ropes and clinging to him. He knelt, pulling all three of them into his arms, into a fierce, protective embrace. Their tears soaked his shirt, their small, trembling bodies pressed against his. "It's okay," he whispered, his voice cracking. "It's over now." He held them tight, the weight of them the most precious thing he had ever known. "We're going home," he said. And for the first time, he knew, without a single doubt, what that word really meant. They didn't speak on the walk back. There were no words for what they had endured. Heath carried Lahi, who had fallen into an exhausted sleep, in his arms. Isaac and Nora walked on either side of him, their small hands clutching his coat. They were a strange, wounded little procession moving through the dark woods, but they were moving together. Back at the first cabin, the real one, the one he'd built with hope in his heart, he lit a fire. The flames chased the cold shadows from the corners and brought a fragile warmth back into their lives. He cleaned their cuts, bandaged their rope-burned wrists, and made them a pot of sweet, milky tea. They slept huddled together in his own bed, a tangle of limbs and blankets. They wouldn't let him go. Heath sat on the edge of the mattress all night, his back against the wall, the rifle by his side, watching them breathe. He had faced the monster. He had faced the dark whispers of his own heart that told him he was an imposter. And he had won. He hadn't bought them. He had fought for them. He had bled for them. That, he realized, was the currency that mattered. But the world wasn't done testing him. He knew that. The fight with Barlow was just one battle. The war for his family was far from over. A week later, a rider came. Heath saw him from a long way off, a lone figure on the trail from town. He wasn't riding like a man in a hurry. He was riding with purpose. Heath sent the children inside and stood on the porch, his face a hard, unreadable mask. The rider was the town marshal, a man named Crane. He was a decent man, but he was the law, and Heath knew he had broken at least a dozen of its rules. Crane dismounted slowly, his eyes taking in the scene, the quiet cabin, the mended fence, the clear signs of a life being lived here. "Heath," he said, his voice grave. "Marshal," Heath replied, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. "There's a man down in my jail," Crane said, getting straight to the point. "Name of Boone Barlow. Found him half dead in a gully. He's been talking." Heath didn't move. "He's wanted in 3 territories," the marshal continued. "Assault, abandonment, and worse. There's a bounty on his head, a big one." He paused, his gaze sharp. "He says you're the one who put him in that gully." "He took my children," Heath said, his voice low and dangerous. Crane nodded slowly. "So he said. He also said they ain't legally yours. Said you bought 'em like livestock off the church steps for $3. Here it was. The moment he had been dreading. The law had finally caught up to him. They would take the children. They would send them away to some orphanage, some institution where they would be just numbers on a page. His fragile, cobbled-together family would be shattered. "The law is a slow, clumsy thing, Heath," Crane said, his eyes softening just a fraction. "It doesn't always see what's right. It just sees what's written down. And right now, there's nothing written down that says these kids belong to you." Heath's heart felt like a block of ice in his chest. He could see Nora's face peeking through the window, her eyes wide with fear. "But," Crane said, reaching into his coat, "the law can sometimes be bent." He pulled out a thick sheaf of papers and a pen. Barlow, in his fever-addled state, signed a confession. In it, he relinquishes all claim to the children, says he ain't their kin, just a monster who tormented them. And the bounty on his head, well, it's more than enough to cover the court fees. He held out the papers to Heath. "These are adoption papers. A judge I know owes me a favor. He'll sign them, no questions asked. All you have to do is write your name." Heath stared at the papers, his vision blurring. He took the pen, his hand shaking so badly he could barely hold it. He looked at the line at the bottom of the page, the line that said father's name. He thought of the doctor's letter. He thought of the word baron. Then he thought of 3 small faces and a voice whispering Papa in the dark. With a hand that was suddenly steady, he signed his name. Heath Camden. Father. It was official. It was real. They were his. But as Marshal Crane rode away, leaving the papers and a newfound peace behind, he called out one last thing. "There was another man in town asking about you, Heath. About the kids. Said his name was James, Robert James. Said he was Nora's father." The fragile piece shattered into a million pieces. The world, it seemed, had an endless supply of ghosts, and another one was on its way. The name hung in the air like smoke from a dying fire. Robert James, Nora's father. Heath felt a cold dread, a familiar fear that this newfound peace was just a mirage. He hadn't told the children, not yet. He didn't know how. How do you tell a little girl who has just started to feel safe that a ghost from her past is coming to haunt her? For weeks, every rider on the horizon made his heart leap into his throat. He watched the trail, his calm exterior hiding a frantic, desperate prayer. "Don't come, just stay away." Life went on. Isaac grew more confident, his carvings more intricate. Lahi started talking more, her sentences short and to the point, just like the man she now called Papa, without hesitation. And Nora was beginning to bloom. She laughed more, a bright, clear sound that filled the cabin. She had stopped sleeping with her twig dolls clutched in her hand. She was letting go of the past. And then, one hot afternoon in late May, the past rode up to their fence. The man was thin and weary, his face etched with the kind of sorrow that time can't heal. His clothes were worn, his horse lathered with the sweat of a long journey. He didn't approach the cabin. He just dismounted and stood by the fence, staring at their home with a hungry, broken expression. Heath's stomach clenched. It was him. It had to be. He stepped off the porch, his movements slow and deliberate. "Can I help you with something?" he asked, his voice flat. The man flinched, as if the sound of Heath's voice was an accusation. He took off his dusty hat, revealing a tangle of thinning hair. I'm looking for a girl, name of Nora James." "She's here," Heath said, his body a solid wall between the stranger and the cabin. "But she ain't available." "Please," the man whispered, his voice cracking. "I ain't here to make trouble. I need to see her, to know she's all right. I swear on my life I'll ride away after. Just one look." Heath studied the man. He saw the desperation in his eyes, but he also saw something else, a deep, profound shame. This wasn't a monster like Barlow. This was just a broken man. What right did Heath have to stand in his way? What right did he have to keep a father from his child? He turned and gave a short, sharp whistle. Nora came out onto the porch, a smudge of dirt on her cheek from the garden. She saw the stranger at the fence, and she froze. All the light, all the laughter of the past few weeks drained from her face. She looked old again, weary. "Pa?" she whispered, her voice so small Heath barely heard it. The man, Robert James, just stared at her, his face a canvas of pain and regret. "Nora," he choked out. The silence was deafening. The birds stopped singing. The wind held its breath. Why? Nora finally asked, her voice flat and empty of emotion. Why now? I got sober, Robert said, the words tumbling out in a rush. A year now. I wanted to come sooner, but I was afraid. Afraid I'd mess up whatever good thing you'd found. You left me, she said, the words like stones. You left us with him. She didn't have to say Barlow's name. They all knew who him was. I know, Robert whispered, his head bowed. And I will die with that shame. I had to see you. I had to know you were okay. Nora didn't answer. She just stood on the porch, a tiny, immovable statue of judgment. Heath's heart broke for her. He saw her look at him, a silent question in her eyes. What do I do? He gave a tiny, almost imperceptible nod. It's your choice. Slowly, Nora walked down the steps. She didn't run. She didn't cry. She walked with a solemn dignity that was heartbreaking to watch. She stopped a few feet from the fence, a safe distance from the man who was her father. I'm okay, she said, her voice clear and strong. Robert looked up, tears streaming down his weathered cheeks. You look just like your mother. At the mention of her mother, Nora's composure finally cracked. A single tear traced a path through the dirt on her cheek. She reached into the pocket of her dress and pulled out a small, tattered photograph. It was the only thing she had from her old life, a picture of a beautiful young woman with kind eyes, holding a baby. She held it out to him. Robert took it with a trembling hand, his gaze fixed on the image. She was so good, he sobbed. Better than me. I know, Nora said, her voice soft now. I'm trying to be like her. He looked from the photo to his daughter, his beautiful, strong, surviving daughter. You already are, he whispered. He stood there for a long moment, clutching the photograph to his chest. Then, without another word, he turned, mounted his horse, and rode away, never once looking back. Nora watched him go until he was just a speck on the horizon. She didn't cry. She just stood there, straight and tall. Then she turned and walked back to the cabin, back to the only father she had ever truly known. That night, Heath found her sitting on the porch steps, watching the fireflies. Are you all right? He asked gently. She shrugged. I thought I would be angry or sad, but I'm not. I just feel quiet, like a door I didn't know was open has finally closed. She looked up at him, her eyes shining in the moonlight. You'll still keep me, right? Heath's heart felt like it was going to burst. He sat down beside her and put his arm around her small shoulders. Nora, he said, his voice thick with emotion. I didn't take you in because I had to. I took you in because I chose you, and I will choose you every single day for the rest of my life. She leaned her head against his shoulder, and they sat there together, watching the fireflies dance in the darkness, a father and a daughter, bound not by blood, but by something far, far stronger. The peace that followed was real. It was earned. For the first time, Heath allowed himself to believe it might last. The ghosts had been faced, the papers were signed, the family was whole. But the mountains had one last trial for him, one last test. It happened on a hot day in June. He was out by the barn, mending a harness, the sun beating down on his back. He felt a sudden, sharp pain in his chest, a crushing weight that stole his breath and sent him staggering to his knees. The world tilted, the edges of his vision turning gray. He collapsed in the dirt, the world going black. It was Isaac who found him. The boy's scream was a sound of pure terror that echoed off the peaks. Together, Nora and Isaac, with a strength born of desperation, dragged their father into the cabin. Heath awoke days later. The first thing he saw was the worried face of Doc Miller from town, bending over him. The first thing he felt was the small, warm weight of Lahi's hand in his. You're a lucky man, Heath, the doctor said, his voice grim. Your heart gave out. You need to rest. No more heavy work. You need to slow down. Slow down? How could he slow down? There was a garden to tend, wood to chop, a family to provide for. I can't, Heath rasped. The doctor smiled sadly. You have to. If not for you, then for them. He looked around the small cabin. Nora was asleep in a chair by the fire, exhausted from her vigil. Isaac stood by the window, his shoulders slumped, but his eyes watchful. And Lahi was curled on the rug at the foot of his bed, a tiny, faithful guard dog. They had saved him. His children had saved him. And so, he rested. And a strange and wonderful thing happened. His family took over. Isaac, with his thin but wiry frame, took on the heavy chores, his face set with a grim determination. Nora became the heart of the home, cooking and cleaning and bossing everyone around with a loving authority. And Lahi became his nurse, a tiny tyrant who scolded him if he tried to get up too soon and made sure he drank all his broth. Lying in that bed, watching them, Heath realized the truth. He hadn't saved them. They had saved him. They had filled the empty, broken spaces in his soul. They had given him a purpose, a reason to live, a reason to fight. But the world wasn't done with him. Not yet. There was one more ghost, the biggest one of all. One morning, Marshal Crane rode up again. This time, he wasn't carrying legal papers. He was carrying a letter. An old, yellowed envelope addressed in a delicate, familiar hand Heath hadn't seen in over a decade. His blood turned to ice. It was from Rose, his wife, the woman who had shared his bed, his dreams, and then had vanished one night, leaving behind nothing but a cold hearth and a broken man. He had thought she was dead. He had mourned her. He had buried her in the graveyard of his memory. With trembling hands, he broke the seal. Heath, the letter began. If this finds you, it is because I have finally found the courage to send it. I know you cannot forgive me. I do not ask you to. But you deserve the truth. I was with child when I left. But the child was not yours, Heath. I was unfaithful. I was a coward. I ran. My daughter's name is May. She is 10 years old now. Her father passed last winter. And I am not long for this world myself. I am in a charity house in Dry Hollow. May has no one. I don't ask you to love her, but I ask you to see her. If there is any part of the good man I betrayed still left in you, please, see that she is safe. That is all I ask. Forgive me. Heath stared at the letter, the world crumbling around him. Another child. A daughter his wife had borne by another man. A child who was now an orphan. Alone. Just like his own children had been. He looked up at the marshal, his eyes full of a pain so deep it was bottomless. Dry Hollow, he said, his voice a hoarse whisper. She passed a week ago, Crane said gently. The girl, May, she's at the parish house. The priest said she hasn't spoken a word since. Heath closed his eyes. He saw the auction block. He saw 3 small, terrified faces. He saw a little girl in a dusty corner, all alone in the world. He had no more room in his heart. It was full. It was overflowing. And yet, he opened his eyes. I'll ride out in the morning. His family was about to get bigger. The ride to Dry Hollow was a journey through a landscape of ghosts. Every mile marker was a headstone for a part of his life he thought was long buried. Rose, the betrayal, the lonely years that followed. He was riding into the heart of his own past, and he didn't know what he would find there. Dry Hollow was a sad, forgotten town. The parish house smelled of dust and despair. The priest who greeted him was a tired man with kind eyes. She's in the back, he said, his voice low. She won't talk. She won't eat. She just sits. It's like her soul has gone out. Heath walked into the small, dim room. In the corner, a small figure was curled into a ball, clutching a worn doll with one button eye. Her hair was pale, her dress was patched, and her feet were bare. She was the very picture of abandonment. He knelt slowly, not wanting to frighten her. May, he said softly. Your mother. She sent me. The girl looked up. Her eyes were a pale, washed-out blue, as empty as a winter sky. There was no fear, no hope, no emotion at all, just a vast, terrifying emptiness. He knew then that words were useless. He reached into the inner pocket of his coat. His fingers closed around a small, smooth object. It was a little wooden horse he had carved years and years ago, back when he and Rose were still dreaming of a child. He had poured all his foolish, hopeful love into that little piece of wood. He'd never had anyone to give it to. Until now. He held it out to her. "I made this a long time ago," he said, his voice rough. "For a child I thought I'd have. I never got to give it to them. I thought maybe you'd like it." She stared at the horse for a long, silent moment. Her gaze was so intense it was almost painful. Then, with a slow, hesitant movement, she reached out her small, thin hand and took it. Her fingers were cold as ice. "I'm Heath," he said. "I have a cabin up in the mountains. It's warm in the winter. I've got 3 other kids. They'll probably pester you something awful. And a dog named Tinker who is very stupid but very kind." She said nothing. She just stared at the wooden horse in her hand, her thumb tracing its carved mane. He stood up, his knees cracking. "I'll be on the porch," he said. "You take your time." He waited. An hour passed. Then 2. The sun began to set, bleeding purple and orange across the desolate landscape. He had started to think she wasn't coming, that he had failed. Then the door creaked open. She stood in the doorway, a small, silent silhouette against the dying light. In one hand, she held the one-eyed doll. In the other, she clutched the wooden horse. He didn't say a word. He just held out his hand. She didn't take it. But she walked to his side. And together, they walked out of the town of Dry Hollow, leaving the ghosts behind. The journey home was a quiet one. May didn't speak, but she watched. She watched everything. She watched his hands as he built a fire. She watched the way the stars looked in the high mountain sky. She watched him with those pale, empty eyes, and he didn't know if she was judging him or just seeing him. When they arrived back at the cabin, his other children were waiting on the porch. They stood in a silent, solemn line, their faces a mixture of curiosity and apprehension. Lahi, never one to beat around the bush, spoke first. "Is she our new sister?" she asked, her hands on her hips. Heath dismounted and helped May down from the horse. "I reckon she might be," he said softly. Lahi marched right up to May and looked her up and down, a serious, critical inspection. May didn't flinch. She just stood there, clutching her doll and her horse. Lahi gave a single, decisive nod. "Well," she announced, "we have extra cornbread, so I guess you can stay." Nora stepped forward, her expression softer. "What's your name?" she asked gently. Heath looked at May, letting her answer for herself. For the first time he saw a flicker of something in her eyes, a hesitation, a struggle. Then, so softly it was barely a whisper, she spoke her first word to them. "May." A wave of emotion so powerful it almost buckled his knees washed over Heath. Nora smiled, a brilliant, welcoming smile, and held out her hand. May looked at the offered hand. Then, after a long moment, she reached out and took it. Isaac just grinned. "I hope you like tree houses," he said, "because ours is the best one in the whole world." That night, there were 5 plates on the table instead of 4. May ate slowly, her eyes darting from face to face, taking everything in. When Lahi accidentally knocked her spoon to the floor and everyone laughed, a small, hesitant smile touched May's lips. It was a fragile, fleeting thing, but Heath saw it. It was the first glimmer of light in her empty sky. It was a beginning. Years passed. The children grew. The seasons turned. The cabin on the mountain became a home, overflowing with life. Nora became a teacher, Isaac, a master carpenter, Lahi, the best horse trainer in 3 counties, and May, quiet, steady May, she stayed. She found her voice not in words, but in the garden. She could make anything grow. She coaxed life from the rocky soil, her hands gentle and sure. She never married. The mountain was her home. Her family was her world. One evening, an old gray-haired Heath sat on the porch watching the sunset. May, a young woman now, came and sat beside him. "Pa," she said softly, "why did you come for me?" He looked at her, at the daughter who was not his by blood, but who was his by every measure of the heart. He smiled, a gentle, weary smile. Because, he said, his voice thick, your mother wrote a letter to a man who used to be broken. But by the time that letter found me, your brother and sisters had already put me back together. There was room. There was always room for you. She leaned her head on his shoulder, and they watched the last rays of sun disappear behind the peaks. He was Heath Camden, the man who was told he could never be a father, the man who had built a family out of the broken pieces of other people's lives, the man who had faced down monsters and ghosts and his own broken heart. And he had won. He had everything. The final test didn't come with a roar, but with a quiet, insidious whisper from the world beyond their mountain. It had been 5 years since May had come home. 5 years of hard-won peace. Heath was older now, his hair more gray than brown, his joints aching with the memory of too many cold winters, but his heart was full. Then a man named Camden Rusk rode into their lives. He was everything the mountain was not. He was slick and polished, dressed in an Eastern suit that looked ridiculous against the rugged backdrop. He had a charming smile that never reached his cold, calculating eyes. He rode right up to the cabin as if he owned it. The children, no longer small, but still fiercely protective, gathered on the porch. Isaac stood with his arms crossed, his stance a silent challenge. Lahi's hand rested on the handle of a knife at her belt. Nora and May stood behind them, their faces grim. Heath McAllister, Rusk said, his voice smooth as oiled leather. He wasn't using the name Camden. Heath hadn't used that name in 20 years. It's Heath, he said, his voice a low rumble. Just Heath. I come with a business proposition, Rusk said, his eyes flicking over the children, lingering for a moment on May. A matter of an inheritance. Heath's blood ran cold. Your late wife, Rose, Rusk continued, pulling a sheaf of official-looking documents from his coat. It seems her family was quite wealthy. Land, mineral rights, a sizable fortune, and in her will she named you as her next of kin. He held out the papers. It's all yours, Heath. More money than you could ever dream of. Enough to give these children a life of ease. Send them to fancy schools back east. Set them up for life. Heath looked at the papers. Then he looked at his children. He saw Isaac, who could build a house with his own 2 hands. He saw Lahi, who could gentle the wildest horse with a whisper. He saw Nora, who could teach a child to read and spark a fire in their mind. He saw May, who could bring life from barren ground. They didn't need a life of ease. They had something better. They had strength. They had purpose. They had love. He looked back at Rusk, his eyes clear and hard as granite. They already have a future, he said, his voice ringing with a power that had nothing to do with money. They built it themselves, right here. He turned his back on the man and his fortune. You ride on back to wherever you came from, he called over his shoulder. And you tell them we're not for sale. Rusk stood there for a moment, his charming smile gone, replaced by a look of disbelief. Then he mounted his horse and rode away, taking the empty promises of the outside world with him. Heath walked back onto the porch and pulled his 4 children into a fierce embrace. They were his fortune. They were his legacy. 20 more years passed. The world changed, but the cabin on the mountain remained a sanctuary. Heath grew old, his body failing, but his spirit shining brighter than ever. He passed on a cold winter's evening, in his own bed, surrounded by the 4 souls who had saved him. His last breath was a peaceful sigh. They buried him under the tall cedar tree at the edge of the clearing. They didn't carve his name on the stone. They just carved one word: Father. Years later, long after the children were grown with families of their own, May, who had never left the mountain, received a letter. It was from a man she didn't know. You won't remember me, it read, but I was at the auction that day. I was one of the other orphans. For years I hated your family. I was jealous of what you had, but I heard the stories about your father, about how he fought for you. And it gave me hope. I never found a family like yours, but knowing it existed gave me the courage to build a life for myself. Thank you. May folded the letter, a tear slipping down her cheek. She looked out at the mountain, at the home her father had built. The world would tell the story of the infertile mountain man who bought 3 orphans for $3, but they would get it wrong. It was never about what he bought. It was about the price he was willing to pay. He paid in sleepless nights, in fear, in blood, and in a love so vast it healed not just his children, but his own broken soul. He gave them everything, and in return, they gave him a name, a home, and a life worth more than all the gold in the world. If you were moved by the story of Heath and the family he built from love and courage, don't forget to like this video and hit that subscribe button. You never know when the next story will be the one that changes the way you see the world.